The French coast was a black wall on the edge of the world, a jagged line where the land fell straight into the channel and waves burst in white against the cliffs. Far above the surf, on the lip of that cliff, near a small place called Bruneval, a pale dish of metal turned slowly, sweeping the sky that no one could see. Inside a low concrete shelter, a German operator smoked, half watching the wavering blip on his cathode screen and half listening to the chug of a diesel generator behind the wall. The set was called Würzburg, and for the men who served it, it was routine. Planes appeared as green ghosts, were passed to controllers, then to searchlights and guns and night fighters. For months now, British bombers had come in the dark, and for months this odd marriage of electronics and artillery had met them with deadly efficiency. The operator did not know that in London someone had given his radar a different name, calling it the Eyes of German Air Defense. He did not know that, hundreds of kilometers away across the water, a small group of men had been chosen for the sole purpose of stealing the machine he tended. He flicked ash into a tray, leaned closer to his scope, and frowned at a faint, low-flying echo that came and went on the edge of the display. "Nothing special," he muttered to his colleague in German, and went back to his cigarette. 10 miles out over the sea, in the cramped belly of a Whitley bomber, men in red berets checked their equipment in the dark and waited for the green light. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, Britain's bomber offensive was in trouble. Reports crossing Winston Churchill's desk admitted what crews had been whispering for months, that in nighttime raids over Germany, a shocking proportion of bombs simply missed. Internal studies suggested that well over half, even as much as 3/4, of the explosives fell short of their intended targets and vanished into fields, forests, or towns never meant to be hit. Yet German defenses seemed to find the bombers with unsettling precision. Searchlights caught them forming up, flak batteries walked shells onto the right height and range, and night fighters appeared as if vectored by an unseen hand. British scientists and airmen knew roughly why, realizing that both sides had entered a new kind of war, a radar war. Britain had built its chain home line and used it to win the Battle of Britain. Now Germany had built its own network, consisting of long-range Freya stations to see far, and a newer, tighter beam set called Würzburg to measure precise range and height for guns and fighters. Aerial photographs of the occupied coast of France told part of the story. Slim masts and curious dishes appeared in regular patterns along the Channel shore. Intelligence officers traced cable runs, counted support buildings, and marked gun pits on blow-ups of the prints. But photos could not reveal what really mattered, such as the exact frequencies, pulse patterns, resolution, and blind spots of the enemy's system. For that, someone had to put their hands, not just their eyes, on an actual Würzburg set. Destroying a radar was one thing, and Bomber Command and the Royal Navy had done it before, but at the Air Ministry and in the secretive world of British radar research, a more ambitious idea took shape. They decided not to smash the enemy's eyes, but to steal one of them and take it home. Somewhere, they knew, there was a station just vulnerable enough to attempt it. The breakthrough came when reconnaissance Spitfires brought back a series of unusually clear photographs of a lonely notch in the French coast northeast of Le Havre. There, at a place named Bruneval, the cameras caught something impossible to miss. A circular dish stood near the edge of a cliff, with a line of posts and cables leading back to a large house set slightly inland. Analysts enlarged the images, identifying the house, Manoir de la Falaise, as the control and accommodation block. A short distance from it, right on the lip of the cliff, stood a radar platform with the unmistakable skeleton of a parabolic reflector. From other angles, a separate mast and structures suggested that Bruneval hosted not one, but 2 sets. It had a long-range Freya for early warning and, critically, a Würzburg dish for precision tracking. French resistance sources confirmed that German troops were billeted around the site and that a garrison guarded the approaches from the land side. Coastal guns, machine gun nests, wire, and mines watched the shoreline below the cliff. On paper, the station was well defended against a raid from the sea. But it had one glaring vulnerability, standing almost alone on the cliff top, with open fields behind it and relatively light local forces compared to the heavy coastal batteries facing the channel. In London, officers in the headquarters of Combined Operations under Lord Louis Mountbatten studied the photographs and listened to the scientists who wanted their radar prize. A direct naval assault would run straight into the teeth of the defenses and probably end in slaughter, resulting in a destroyed rather than captured Würzburg set. But they wondered what would happen if men could fall from the sky. They could strike the station before the garrison fully reacted and then slip down to a quieter stretch of beach for pickup by waiting boats. The more they looked at Bruneval, the more it seemed like a place made for something new. It would be a carefully orchestrated air-sea smash and grab. The operation that emerged from these discussions was given the code name Biting. The nickname captured the intent, which was not to gnaw away at the German defenses, but to take one sharp, calculated bite out of them and carry the piece home. At its center would be a company-sized group of airborne troops drawn from C Company of the 2nd Battalion, newly forming 1st Parachute Brigade. Their commander, Major John Frost, was a cool, precise officer with enough imagination to handle a mission that would rely on speed, surprise, and coordination with the Royal Navy. Frost's men were to jump in the night near Bruneval, seize the radar site and its operators, and cover a Royal Air Force specialist while he dismantled the set. They would then fight their way to a small cove where landing craft would snatch them off the beach. Because the raid depended on tight timing and clear roles, Frost's subunits were organized into distinct groups, each given the name of a British admiral. One was tasked with storming Manoir de la Falaise, another with taking the radar platform, and another with securing the route to the beach through a steep valley. Yet another group was to hold a reserve position in case anything went wrong. These code names, Nelson, Jellicoe, Hardy, Drake, and Rodney, gave a touch of naval tradition to a mission that would unite sailors, soldiers, and airmen in a single, intricate stroke. But behind all the planning, charts, and sand tables lived one simple problem. Even if Frost's men reached the Würzburg set, who would know how to take it apart? The answer was a quiet, non-commissioned officer in the Royal Air Force named Flight Sergeant Charles William Hall Cox. He was a radar technician who had spent the war among cables and cathode tubes, not in the glamour of fighter squadrons or bomber crews. To many soldiers, a man like Cox might have seemed an unlikely hero, more at home in a lab than in a raid. But for Operation Biting, he was the linchpin. Cox would have only minutes under fire to identify the most valuable components of the radar, loosen them from the structure, and get them aboard the evacuation craft. The mission was judged so sensitive that Cox received something few technicians ever did. He was assigned a personal bodyguard with explicit, chilling instructions. His escort's duty was not just to keep him safe from enemy bullets, but to ensure that if the worst came, the radar expert could not be captured alive along with his knowledge of Britain's own systems. It was a brutal calculus of secrecy, one that underlined how far into the technological shadows the war had already gone. Weeks before the first aircraft engine turned over for Bruneval, Frost's men were already rehearsing an attack on a place none of them had ever seen. On some lonely corner of the English coast, or in a guarded training ground inland, engineers built a rough mock-up of a cliff-edge villa and a radar platform. It was a skeleton of timber and metal that approximated the Würzburg's dish and its hut. Night after night, paratroopers practiced jumping, forming up quickly in the dark, storming the house, and overwhelming the defenders in seconds. They drilled the route from the mock radar site down to an improvised beach, carrying weighted boxes meant to stand in for heavy equipment. Royal Navy crews likewise trained to time their approach to a hostile shore, land rapidly, load men and crates, and pull away before coastal guns could find the range. Cox, who had spent much of his military career around test benches, now found himself crawling over the mock-up radar in a field. He unscrewed bolts by torchlight under the impatient gaze of infantry officers. He had to learn not only what to take, but how to recognize those parts in an unfamiliar mounting, quickly and under stress. There were no second chances built into Operation Biting. If he took the wrong pieces or needed too long to extract them, the raiders might die for nothing. The rehearsals were intense and, at times, grimly humorous. A man from Frost's company might bump shoulders with Cox in the dark and mutter that if anything happened, he was supposed to shoot the sergeant before he let the Germans grab him. It was a joke with a blade in it, the kind men make when they understand the stakes, but can do nothing except train harder. On top of the strain of secrecy and precision came the weather. Raids across the channel depended on tides, moonlight, cloud cover, and wind. More than once, as the date for biting drew near, the planners had to postpone because conditions were wrong for the paratroop drop or the naval approach. Each delay tightened nerves. Men who had steeled themselves to jump on a given night were told to stand down, then wind themselves up again for the next try. By late February 1942, everything was finally ready. The men knew their roles, and the mock cliff and mock radar had been attacked so many times they were almost familiar ground. Now only the real cliff, the real house, the real Germans, and the real Würzburg remained. On the evening of the 27th of February, 1942, 12 modified Whitley bombers took off from bases in southern England, each carrying a stick of paratroopers and their gear. The aircraft lumbered into the night, one by one, engines droning, red berets nodding as turbulence jostled them in the gloom of the fuselage. The men sat facing each other on narrow benches, their chutes bulky on their backs, weapons strapped awkwardly across knees. There was little conversation. Those who had been in combat before retreated into themselves, while those new to action stared at the floor or fiddled with harness buckles. Major Frost moved up and down the line in his aircraft, checking straps with the steadiness of a man who knew that calm could be contagious. Far above the waves, the formation turned onto its crossing. The pilots flew low, below the best range of German radar, lights out, radios kept to a minimum of necessary calls. In a twist of irony that no one missed, the raiders depended on not being seen by the very kind of radars they had come to rob. Somewhere over the channel, a man close to Cox may have leaned in and spoken over the engine noise. "Sergeant," he might have said, "tonight we find out whose radar is better, ours for getting us here, or theirs for trying to stop us." Cox, who had spent his career making sure British sets did work, might have just nodded, eyes on the dim glow of the jump light. Ahead, the French coast crawled closer. In the radar hut at Bruneval, that faint, low echo brushed the edge of the Würzburg's display again and again. The operator noted it, then dismissed it as sea clutter or some low-flying patrol, never suspecting that what his machine barely sensed was the beginning of an operation aimed squarely at it. The jump zones around Bruneval were not forgiving. The land broke and rolled in shallow valleys and fields, framed by hedges, orchards, and scattered farm buildings. The crews of the Whitleys had to find their markers at night, in hostile airspace, under the pressure of timing that left little room for error. Some did it well. As the green light snapped on in Frost's aircraft, his men stood, shuffled toward the open hole in the floor, and flung themselves into the chill air almost exactly where planners had intended. Parachutes slapped open above fields not far from the manoir and radar site. Men hit the ground hard, rolled, then went to work cutting themselves free and forming up under non-reflective hooded lights. Other pilots, grappling with navigation in the dark and the need to avoid obvious landmarks that might be watched, released their sticks a little early. One of the groups tasked with securing the route down to the beach, the force later known by the name Nelson, found itself landing some distance south of the intended zone. Out of easy contact with Frost's core, men crashed into hedges or landed in small orchards. They picked themselves up and tried to orient in countryside they knew only from maps and briefings. Frost quickly realized that not every piece of his plan had dropped where it should. But he also knew that Allied aircraft were burning fuel, that German lookouts might already be alert, and that the longer he delayed, the more time the defenders had to recover. He gathered what forces he could reach, checked that key groups for the house and radar were present, and gave the signal to move out toward the silhouetted line of the cliff. Behind them, scattered in the darkness to the south, some of the Nelson men began their own hurried march toward the objective. From the sea, Manoir de la Falaise must once have looked like a handsome house, perched above the water, its windows catching evening light. In February 1942, it was a German military installation, its rooms filled with bunk beds, field radios, and steel-helmeted guards. Outside, trenches and foxholes spider-webbed the ground between the house and the radar station. Frost's advance parties approached the compound from the landward side, using darkness and what cover the fields provided. Sections codenamed Jellicoe, Hardy, and Drake knew their tasks, which were to surround the house and the radar, isolate pockets of resistance, and move as soon as the word was given. At the signal, they rose from the fields and closed in. A sentry shouted and fired, the muzzle flash briefly etching his shape against the wall, and was cut down by a burst from a Sten gun. Windows shattered. Men in German uniform tried to bring weapons to bear from doorways and were met by grenades and automatic fire. Inside the manoir, 2 German soldiers found themselves staring down British muzzles before they could properly react. Dragged aside and questioned in quick, urgent German, they gave up what they knew about the composition of the local garrison. They revealed how many men were present, where the supporting troops lay, and what fixed positions might still be manned beyond the immediate buildings. While one part of the raiding force cleared room after room, another swung toward the radar platform on the cliff edge. There, under the skeletal bowl of the Würzburg dish, they found the operator and his comrades in a confusion of shouted questions and half-formed orders. They stared at the sudden, incomprehensible sight of British paratroopers in the darkness. The man who had minutes before dismissed a faint echo on his screen was now a prisoner, shoved towards the house with his hands on his head. The attackers had achieved what every plan for biting hinged on, which was surprise, speed, and the intact capture of both the station and some of its personnel. Now, attention could shift to the real heart of the raid. For Flight Sergeant Charles Cox, the moment to which weeks of rehearsal had led, arrived almost without ceremony. 1 minute, he was in the lee of a building, listening to bursts of gunfire and the distant shouts of German and English voices. The next, someone from Frost's group shouted that the radar was secure, and the circle of paratroopers around the dish shifted to admit him. Up close, the Würzburg was both familiar and foreign. Cox recognized the general form, seeing the parabolic reflector, the feed structure, and the cabin housing the electronics. But its fittings were German, with metric bolts, continental connectors, and layout decisions that bore the stamp of another engineering culture. He had to translate his mental picture of a radar into this alien hardware in seconds. He snapped instructions to the sappers and paratroopers who had been assigned to help him, pointing to junction boxes and access panels. He told them he wanted specific units and racks inside, ordering them to forget the rest unless they had time. Knives and tools flashed in the beams of shuttered torches. Men wrenched open casings, cut cable runs that could not be disconnected quickly, and eased heavy sub-assemblies out of their frames. Somewhere overhead, distant guns began to mutter, a sign that the wider garrison was waking up. Cox worked faster. A burst of German fire cracked across the edge of the site. His bodyguard, a paratrooper whose orders reached beyond the usual duty of a protector, dropped to a knee, scanning the darkness beyond the radar's silhouette. He spared Cox a glance and hissed that they had to hurry because the enemy would be on top of them any minute. Cox answered through gritted teeth, hands deep in the guts of a unit that housed the set's timing circuits. He said he needed another minute, because without this component, they would say he left the best part behind. It was not bravado. The value of Operation Biting depended on which pieces of Würzburg reached British labs. The dish itself was useful but not crucial, as its shape could be approximated from photos and measurements. The subtlety lay in the transmitter, receiver, and time-based components, which were the parts that defined how the set saw the sky. All around, the raiders' foothold on the cliff began to feel less secure. Gunfire from the direction of the inland garrison grew sharper. German soldiers who had not been caught in the initial rush were organizing, finding fields of fire, and probing the edges of Frost's positions. The raid had succeeded in landing and striking first, but it was not over. It was only now entering the most fragile phase, which was withdrawal. Cox's men wrestled another heavy box onto a waiting trolley. Somewhere nearer the house, a wounded German shouted for help in the dark, and was answered only by the crack of a British rifle. The paratroopers began looking over their shoulders more often than at the radar, counting the seconds until Major Frost would give the order. They had their prize, and now they had to get it out. Major Frost had never expected Operation Biting to end on the radar platform. The plan had always been a flowing movement to land, strike, strip, and escape to the sea before German reserves could trap his men against the cliffs. As soon as Cox signaled that the most essential components were off the mounting and loaded, Frost began to shift his weight southward. He moved toward the steep valley that carved a path down to the shingle. It was then that the flaw introduced in the sky made itself felt on the ground. The Nelson detachment, which had been intended to move ahead of the main body and suppress any strong points covering the route to the beach, was not where the plan said it would be. Mist dropped in the night and delayed by confusion in the fields. Some of its men were still fighting their own private battle with hedges and farm tracks. That left pockets of German defenders unmolested along the line of withdrawal. As Frost's column of men, prisoners, and a train of trolleys groaning under radar parts moved away from the manoir, they entered the fire of a German machine gun. This gun had been meant to fall silent early in the raid, but now tracers stitched the darkness. The shots struck sparks from stones and drove men to ground. In the first bursts, one of Frost's senior NCOs went down hard, badly wounded. For a few tense moments, the raid teetered. The raiders were now burdened not just with equipment, but with wounded. Ahead lay a choke point that was still in German hands. Behind them, other elements of the garrison were recovering from shock and probing toward the now noisy edge of the compound. Frost reacted with the speed that had recommended him for the job. He detached part of his force, sections operating under the reserve call sign Rodney, and threw them against the machine gun nest. Grenades and small arms fire arced toward the muzzle flash. Men worked along ditches and hedges to flank the position. The gun stuttered, returned fire, and then fell silent as its crew was killed or scattered. There was no time for celebration. The raiders hauled their wounded up and set off again, each delay eating into the fragile schedule that connected their movement to the Navy's approach out on the dark water. The path to the sea at Bruneval was no gentle lane. It dropped steeply from the plateau through a narrow defile called the Valus toward a stony strip of beach hemmed in by cliffs. For men on foot, let alone men balancing heavy crates on improvised trolleys, it was a punishing descent. For defenders with time to prepare, it was a natural killing ground. As Frost's column began to funnel into the valley, German soldiers who had not been caught by the initial assault started to feel their way toward the cliffs from flanking positions. Shots cracked in the darkness overhead. A few grenades exploded against rock, throwing shards and dust down on the heads of the withdrawing troops. Paratroopers alternated between hauling and shooting. When someone shouted that fire was coming from a particular fold in the terrain, a handful of men would drop their burdens. They would scramble up the slope and deliver a fast, violent attack to clear it. Then they would slide back down, shoulders already reaching again for the handles of radar crates. The valley itself was treacherous underfoot. Mud and loose stones made it easy to slip, and more than one man ended up skidding into the legs of another. Cox stumbled with the rest, his boots no better suited to the makeshift goat track than anyone else's. He listened with one ear to the sounds of pursuit behind, and one ear to the creak and bang of the equipment on which the whole mission balanced. Higher up, nearer the plateau, German voices grew more confident. Flares scratched across the sky, bathing parts of the slope in greenish light before fading back to black. Each flare risked revealing the raiders' exact line of movement, but it also showed German soldiers just how far their enemies had already gone. Down in the folds of the land, some of Frost's men muttered tight-lipped encouragements to the overloaded trolleys. One might growl at the frame carrying a particularly heavy component, telling it that it was not staying for the Herrenvolk to admire. Out beyond the surf line, the Royal Navy had its own set of problems. Small craft and support ships had left English ports under cover of darkness, slipping into the channel to rendezvous at a point off the Bruneval coast. Their timing had been worked backward from Frost's planned landing time. It was adjusted for currents, sea state, and the need to avoid obvious patterns that German coast watchers might notice. Crews on the landing craft strained their eyes toward the cliff foot, looking for the agreed signals. They knew only that somewhere above those looming shapes to landward, British paratroopers were fighting Germans over something the scientists wanted badly. Some sailors speculated that they were picking up French codes or captured rockets. When one officer muttered that it was a radar set, or part of one, a rating snorted. He said it had better be worth it, because the enemy would be shooting at them soon enough. They were not wrong. German coastal defenses were not blind. As the raiders neared the shoreline, the presence of Allied craft became harder to hide. Spotters inland could hear engines out at sea. Orders rippled along phone lines to batteries and strongpoints. The Navy knew it was entering a zone where anything that floated might suddenly find itself bracketed by shells from unseen guns. At last, the valley floor leveled, and the smell of salt and seaweed grew thick in the air. The raiders spilled out onto the narrow, pebbled strand, shadows moving against the darker bulk of the cliffs on either side. Waves slapped coldly at their boots. Above them, the mouth of the valley yawned like a gun barrel pointed inland. Frost's men moved to secure a perimeter, while others dragged crates and trolleys past the tide line. Someone set a pre-arranged signal, most likely flares or lamps shielded, and then shone toward the channel in a precise pattern. Others looked uneasily back up the valley, where flickers of light betrayed German movement. Within minutes, the low profiles of landing craft became visible, rising and falling on the swell as they approached the surf. Engines coughed, orders snapped back and forth, and anchors splashed. To the watching paratroopers, the boats were deliverance and new danger in equal measure. As the first craft ground their bows onto the shingle, sailors jumped into the shallows, seizing the gunwales and steadying the ramps. Frost yelled for wounded and key equipment to go first. Men half-carried, half-dragged the boxes containing Würzburg components down to the waterline, slipping on wet stones. One of the Navy ratings, throwing his weight against a crate, grunted and asked over his shoulder what was in there, wondering if it was gold bars. A paratrooper, sweat streaking the dirt on his face, shot back that it was better. He called it the brains of the German radar. It was not a scientifically precise description, but it was close enough to the truth to satisfy everyone hauling under its weight. The Germans were not idle spectators. As soon as the scale of the raid became clear, messages along the coast lit up the defense net. Coastal guns and machine guns were ordered to engage anything that looked like an evacuation attempt. Shells began to splash around the approaches to the landing zone, whistling in from unseen batteries farther along the shore. Machine gun fire from higher ground probed down toward the figures on the beach and the dark hulls just offshore. Tracer lines, red and white, streaked over the foaming tops of waves. Under this mounting fire, discipline and practice held. Sailors and soldiers alike kept moving crates and men up the ramps, pushing them inward to make room. Wounded were laid out where space allowed, among them the senior NCO hit by the clifftop machine gun. Prisoners, including German operators and guards taken alive at the manoir and radar, were bundled aboard under close watch. Their captors knew that the prisoners' minds might hold almost as much interest for interrogators as the hardware itself. Cox felt the shift in motion beneath his boots as the first craft reversed engines and started to back away from the shore. For him, the sight of the cliffs slowly receding in the pre-dawn gloom meant one thing above all. The components he had gambled his life to recover were now beyond the immediate reach of German hands. Not everyone would make that passage. Some of Frost's men became casualties in the last exchanges of fire, and a few would be left behind or captured when they could not reach the craft in time. But the bulk of the raiding party and, crucially, the captured technology and personnel were now on their way into the channel. They were sheltered by the larger ships that had accompanied the landing craft. Out at sea, as the boats formed up and turned for home, gunners stood watch at their stations. They scanned the sky and the horizon, knowing that what lay in their holds made them attractive targets. The best protection they could hope for was speed and surprise, which was still partly on their side. They also relied on the limited window left for German forces to marshal a serious response before the raiders were lost in the dark and the distance. When the first reports of Operation Biting reached headquarters in Britain, they carried an air of almost incredulous relief. Against all the ways such a raid could have gone wrong, the men had returned with exactly what the planners had dared to hope for. They had key parts of a German Würzburg radar and some of the men who had operated it. The casualty lists were mercifully short by the brutal standards of the time. A handful of British dead and wounded, and a few missing or captured, stood against the potential strategic gain. German losses were likewise limited to a small number of killed, wounded, and captured troops at the site. On paper, Biting read like a model raid with clear objectives, accurate intelligence, tight coordination between air and sea, and a solid margin of success. The real measure of the operation's value would not appear on a casualty sheet. It would reveal itself in laboratories and briefing rooms, where scientists and radar officers pored over the captured apparatus. Under guard and far from prying eyes, Cox and his colleagues in the technical branches went to work on the crates he had helped wrestle off the French cliff. There, they found confirmation of what they had suspected, and answers to questions they had only been able to guess at before. The captured modules and construction details allowed British experts to nail down the exact operating frequency of the Würzburg. They also discovered its pulse pattern and its real-world accuracy in range and height. The arrangement of components also revealed how German designers had thought about reliability, cooling, and control. Put together with what interrogations of captured operators revealed, the British now possessed a detailed, practical understanding of how the enemy's precision tracking radar actually worked in the field. This knowledge flowed quickly into tactics. Bomber Command could refine routes and altitudes to exploit any quirks or blind zones. Specialists in electronic warfare could begin to design not just broadband noise to swamp German receivers, but targeted jamming and deception tuned to the peculiarities of Würzburg. In time, when the decision came to unleash Window, clouds of thin metal strips dropped from aircraft to confuse radar. The understanding drawn in part from Bruneval's prize would help shape both its timing and its effects. On the German side, the Bruneval Raid struck like a slap in the face. It was one thing to lose a radar to bombing or sabotage. It was quite another to realize that paratroopers had descended out of the night, overrunning a supposedly protected node in the coastal defense system. They had not merely destroyed the equipment, but carried parts of it away. Commands went out along the occupied shores. Radar sites were to be reinforced, local infantry support improved, and contingency plans written for rapid demolition of sensitive equipment if an attack seemed likely. By the time later Allied raids probed other radar installations, such as the one near Pourville, associated with the ill-fated Dieppe raid, they found a much more alert and hardened environment. Repeating Bruneval's success became far more difficult. In this sense, biting was both a triumph and a warning. It proved that a small, well-trained force could penetrate deep into a technological nerve center and return with valuable intelligence. But it also alerted the enemy to that vulnerability, prompting countermeasures that would raise the cost of similar attempts. For Britain, however, the operation became a symbol of what coordinated, intelligence-driven action could achieve. It was talked about in staff colleges as an example of joint planning, with the Air Force delivering troops by parachute, the Army executing the assault, and the Navy extracting them under fire. All this was done in service of a scientific and strategic aim that transcended any single branch. As the war went on, the names of some of the Bruneval raiders took on lives of their own. Major John Frost would later lead airborne troops in other, larger actions, most famously at the bridge at Arnhem. His career, woven through the tapestry of airborne history, often carried a footnote back to the cold night on the French cliff, when his company executed one of the first British parachute raids of its kind. Flight Sergeant Charles Cox's story remained quieter. The security blanket over radar work meant that for years his exact role in Operation Biting was little advertised. He was recognized with the military medal for his courage and skill under fire, but public narratives of the war tended to focus on fighter aces, tank commanders, and resistance leaders. The image of a man in RAF blue coveralls, wrestling bolts off an enemy machine while bullets snapped overhead, did not fit traditional notions of heroism as easily as a charge across open ground. Among those who understood the technological heart of the conflict, however, Cox and men like him represented something vital. They stood at the intersection of brains and bravery, bridging the gap between the laboratory and the front line. In the quiet rooms where Würzburg parts were laid out for study, each strange connector and tube carried an unspoken reminder. Someone had knelt in the dark under enemy guns to bring this home. For the Paratroopers of C Company, Bruneval became a defining early chapter. Some would remember the sudden bloom of flares over French fields and the hard ground under their boots. Others would recall the fear-laced humor of guarding a man they had orders never to let fall into enemy hands alive. Others still would recall the burning muscles of the descent to the beach, the shouts and curses as crates skidded on wet stones, and the surreal moment when a Navy sailor asked what they had risked so much to fetch. Looking back from an age of satellites and cyber warfare, Operation Biting can seem almost quaint. It involved a handful of men, a small radar, and a short dash across a hostile shore, but the fundamentals it illustrated remain current. It showed that in a technologically saturated conflict, the most valuable targets are often not enemy troops or even weapons, but the systems that let an opponent see, decide, and coordinate. In 1942, that system was a chain of Freya and Würzburg stations linked to guns and night fighters. In later decades, it would be early warning networks, command and control centers, communications hubs, and spacecraft. The principle is the same, because understanding how the other side's eyes and ears work is as important as stopping their fists. Biting also underlined another truth, that sometimes the decisive figure in a battle is neither the general nor the front-rank soldier. It is the specialist in the middle. It is the person who knows exactly which box to unbolt in the dark, and why that box matters more than any number of empty shells from a destroyed gun. The war over Europe's night skies was shaped as much by such people as by the crews who flew through flak and searchlights. On a cold night above the Channel, a small echo flickered on a German radar screen and meant nothing to the men watching it. Hours later, pieces of that same radar lay in crates on the deck of a British ship, salt air blowing over them as they steamed toward England. Between those two moments lies the story of Operation Biting. It is a story of planning and risk, of paratroopers and sailors, and of a quiet technician whose tools were as deadly to the enemy's hopes as any bullet.